I am 76 years old, and most mornings begin with the small negotiations I make with my knees before I dare the first step onto the cold kitchen tile. A slow bargain of breath and caution that ends with the click of the percolator and the smell of coffee pushing back the quiet of the house. This rambler off Stoltzman Road has been mine since 1981, when Ruth and I signed the papers with a baby on her hip, and the bank officer telling me I was young enough to be reckless and old enough to pay for it, and sometimes, when the furnace kicks on and the ducks sigh. I can still hear the echo of my sons thundering down the hall, the thud of a backpack, the scrape of chair legs, the way they would leave the milk on the counter and swear it wasn't them. The milk goes back in the fridge now because I put it there, and the only sound at breakfast is the radio from KTOE murmuring about farm prices and the weather over Blue Earth County. And if I turn the dial just right, I can pretend there is another voice at the table. The clink of Ruth's spoon, her humming, the little laugh in her throat when she'd say I brewed the coffee strong enough to strip paint, and I'd answer that paint ought to fear a man who wakes at 5 and puts in an honest day. I come from men who knew the measure of a board by the weight in their palms, who could read grain the way other people read scripture, and for most of my life I built things that could take a body's weight without groaning, beds that wouldn't wobble when the grandkids leapt onto them, tables that could carry a Thanksgiving feast and still have room for pie. Whitaker and Sons began with a rented garage and a second-hand planer that shed belts if you looked at it sideways. And in those first winters my fingers stayed raw and my breath smoked in the air because we couldn't afford to heat the space unless there were orders on the books, yet I remember those days as the kind that fix a man's spine. When you sweep your own sawdust and your name on the invoice means something you would fight to protect. I hired men older than me who'd been laid off from the mill, hired boys right out of high school who needed a trade more than a pep talk, and we made chairs that didn't squeak, and cabinets with dovetails where the corners met clean and proud, and when we finally moved into a brick building near the river and hung a sign that matched the name on my shirts, I had the stupid, giddy feeling of someone who has gotten away with something grand and decent at the same time. People like to say the business is just numbers, but what I learned is that numbers are only the bones, and the flesh is people who clock in on time because they feel seen, and customers who come back because your word is straighter than a plumb line, and a banker who shakes your hand with his palm open because he knows you'll carry the note even if you have to skip a paycheck. I remember names on my lips the way other folks recall songs. Larry at the lathe who could turn balusters so smooth you'd swear they were silk. Dee who ran the upholstery table and stitched button-tufted backs like prayer. Raphael who knew how to coax walnut into a curve that looked inevitable. And I remember the day the truck from Chicago dropped off 2 hides of oxblood leather, and I told Dee to keep a swatch so we could make one chair that wasn't for sale, a big high back with brass nail heads, and arms thick enough to hold a man's elbows when his shoulders gave out. Something that said to anyone who sat in front of my desk that I stood behind every piece that left our dock. We placed it in my office after hours, everyone grinning like kids, and I can still hear the crew outside the door making jokes about the king sitting down and me trying to act like I didn't care while secretly feeling the chair accept me as if it had been waiting. The hide cool under my palms, the cushion firm, the back catching my weight in a way that made me want to work longer just to be worthy of it. Time does its work on all things, oak, leather, hands, and while the chair wore my shape with a kind of gentle memory, my body kept its own tally of winters in my wrists, and the dull ache between my shoulder blades that sharpened when a storm rolled in. From the Dakotas. And then, 8 years ago, Ruth's heart faltered on a Tuesday afternoon that had started no different than 100 others. And I learned how a house can gain square footage in a day, how the space at the foot of the bed can turn into a field you don't know how to cross, how coffee poured for one steams like an apology. People were kind in the way Midwesterners are. Casseroles on the porch, cards tucked under the mat, a pew full of old employees who stood at the service with their hands clasped like men who'd spent their strength and would spend it again if they knew it would matter. And when the last hymn faded, I went back to the office and sat in that chair as if I needed a place that could keep me from slipping through the floor. For a while, work saved me. The rhythm of orders and payroll, the smell of lacquer and glue that said something was still happening in this world. But grief is a slow flood that finds every crack. And after I fell on the loading dock and spent 2 nights under observation while they poked at my chest and frowned at my charts, I let our lawyer draft the papers that made a path from me to my oldest boy. Caleb was a tidy child who lined up his toy cars in straight rows and liked to correct the weatherman. And he grew into a tidy man with a tidy resume. University of Minnesota, Carlson School, a bracelet of internships that taught him to say synergy without blushing. And when he came back to Mankato with a wife and a leased SUV and told me we needed to scale the brand, I said he was welcome to convince our customers that a chair built faster would sit the same, so long as he listened before he talked. We did our share of pushing and pulling, he with his charts and me with my gut. But in those first couple of years, I believed we were doing the right kind of learning from each other. He taught me what a supply chain could do if you didn't let it choke you, and I taught him that a back order handled with a plain-spoken phone call buys more loyalty than a discount code blasted into the void. His wife, Erin, had the bright, enthusiastic smile of a person who plans other people's parties for a living, and the sharp eyes of someone who can spot a smudge on a window from across a parking lot. And with her came the kind of holidays where dessert arrives in white bakery boxes with bows instead of in the dented tin Ruth used for 30 years, which I told myself was fine, because change is not a sin so long as the anchor holds. When people ask why I left the daily work when I did, I shrug and tell them a heart scare, and a patch of ice took me halfway there. But the truth is more layered and less dramatic. A dawning sense that I had become a man who slowed meetings by telling stories, that my presence caused everyone else to hold their breath a little, that my phone calls were answered with the politeness you give the past. There is a moment all fathers feel, even if they pretend otherwise. A moment when a son's voice lands in your ear and you hear not just the boy you taught to throw, but the man who will move your furniture when you're gone. And that was the moment in which I decided to make the transition formal, not just because I thought it would please Caleb, though it did, but because a business ought to know who is steering, and a family ought to know which way the current is running. We held a small ceremony in the break room because Caleb thought a public event would be good optics, and I stood at the dented soda machine with a sheet cake I could not taste and handed him the office keys while he handed me a pen that wrote my new title in crisp blue ink, Founder. Retirement is a generous word that covers a lot of empty afternoons, and I filled mine in the plain ways men do when they've been married a long time and then have not been married at all. I fixed the door that had always stuck in August, organized coffee cans full of mismatched screws, found Ruth's recipe card for the molasses cookies, and failed to make them twice before getting them right. Went to church on Sundays and took the same pew, sat too long in the hardware store talking paint with a man I barely knew, drove the long way to the river just to watch the bridge shine. Some days I would put on my old work coat and go down to the plant and make a slow circuit with a mug in my hand, asking how the new clamps were working and whether the vendor had delivered the quarter-sawn white oak or that streaky stuff we'd returned last winter. Other days I stayed home because I could feel the air change when I walked in, the way conversations rearranged themselves to accommodate me. And I didn't want to be one more thing the boys had to lift with their backs. I told myself that the office chair was Caleb's for the hours he kept and mine only in memory, and that this was healthy, and that I was a man who could let go with grace. Age is not a cliff, but a series of loose stones. And there were days when I felt sure-footed and days when I misjudged the distance between the car door and the curb. But in my head, the man I was and the man I am still share the same room. And I refuse to be the kind who narrates illness like a lifestyle. If you had asked me how I was, I would have said fine and meant it, meaning that I could carry the groceries in one trip if I used the forearms God gave me, that I could back the pickup into a tight spot at the lumberyard, that I could hold a piece of sandpaper and coax a nick out of a tabletop until the light slid across it clean. What I did not say, because it feels like lining up excuses, is that grief makes you tired in a way a nap cannot fix, and loneliness is a draft that moves through the house no matter how you set the thermostat. And even a man with a name on a building wants sometimes to be asked if he'd like a second cup. I have 2 sons, Caleb, who has the keys, and Ethan, who fled south years ago with a guitar and a stubborn kindness he insisted on guarding from the weather of this town. And we talk on holidays with the careful affection of people who don't want to. Step on the parts that still ache. Caleb and Aaron brought me lasagna in a foil pan at Christmas and asked about my boiler like they were conducting an interview. And when they finally left and the house regained its shape, I realized I had not been hugged properly in months, a discovery that made me both ashamed and angry because it sounds like complaint, and I was raised to swallow such things. In the evenings, I sit in the den with the lamp Ruth picked out in 1994 and read catalogs I don't intend to order from. And if I let my mind drift, I find myself back in that office with the good light across the desk, my elbows planted, my hands tented, the leather creaking as I lean forward to make a point, the chair taking my weight without judgment. And I understand why the stubborn part of me refuses to call that just a chair. It was a witness, a keeper of confessions, the quiet animal that absorbed my worst days and gave me back a spine. It is important to say that I have not been waiting for a fight. And yet I know that something happens to the air when a man who built a life becomes the kind of man people speak around, the way weather moves over a field, without asking the field if it is ready. I have tried to be generous in the way I step back, to let Caleb own his decisions and his mistakes without standing behind him like a shadow that tells him where the light is. But I have also kept the papers in a neat file, the kinds of papers Ruth, practical to her bones, told me we would never need but we kept anyway. Bylaws with my initials in the corners. The deed to the building with my name engraved as if stone could remember. A letter from the bank, written the year the river climbed a little too high and we held fast. These are not weapons, I tell myself, just artifacts. The way a man keeps an old level he no longer needs because its bubble speaks a language he trusts. On days when the wind is right and the smell from the plant slips north to my street, I sit with my coffee and feel the old life move under my skin like a river under ice, and I let the good memories sharpen the present instead of slicing it, because this is what a decent man does if he intends to keep being one. I am not owed anything except the chance to keep my word, but I admit that if there is one indulgence I have kept, it is the way I still think of that chair, not as a throne or a prize, but as a kind of proof that the body of a man and the work of a man can still meet in a place that fits them both. I tell you all this not to justify what comes next, but because introductions matter, and because when my son eventually looked across a table and told me that the chair was no longer mine, the words did not land in a vacuum. They landed in the whole of this life, in the scent of coffee at dawn, in the quiet room where Ruth's sweater still hangs under plastic, in the bruise the percolator leaves on my palm when I twist it too hard, in the memory of a shop whistle and a crew of men who knew how to stand shoulder to shoulder and make a thing worth sitting on. It was on a Sunday evening in late September, when the air outside smelled of dry leaves and rain, that the words fell from my son's mouth with the finality of a slammed door. We had gathered in his house after church, a meal set on the table that Erin had ordered in because, as she said with that bright, brittle laugh of hers, who has time to cook anymore, I had taken my place without thought, the same place I always chose when we shared a table, my back against the wall where I could see the room. And beside me, as it had always been, was the chair that had come from my office, the high-backed oxblood leather chair that had stood behind my desk for decades. They had moved it here after renovations at the plant, Caleb insisting that it fit better in the house now than in the new streamlined office with its glass walls and ergonomic seating. And though I did not protest, inside I had felt as if a piece of my life had been carried off. That evening, I slid into it as naturally as a man slips into his own coat, and Caleb, with the half-smile of someone delivering a sentence, looked across the table and said, "Dad, that chair isn't yours anymore." He did not laugh, did not soften the edges of the remark, just kept his gaze fixed on me as if testing whether I would fight back. At first I thought he was joking, a small cruelty that sons sometimes use to remind their fathers of the shifting balance of power. But the silence that followed was not the silence of humor. It was the kind that presses down like a lid. And even Erin lowered her eyes to her plate, as if to say she would not be my ally. I asked what he meant, though my throat was dry, and he leaned back in his seat, folding his arms in a way that reminded me of myself at his age, except that when I crossed my arms it was usually to hold something in, not to push someone out. "It's mine now," he said. "Everything about the office is mine. The chair, the desk, the contracts, the decisions. You don't sit there anymore. That era is over," he said it calmly, as though reciting the weather. And then he reached for his fork, dismissing me with the scrape of silverware against porcelain. The children giggled, not cruelly, perhaps, but with the careless ease of youth who do not grasp that laughter can cut deeper than knives. My granddaughter whispered something about Grandpa thinking he was still the boss. And my grandson, trying to stifle his grin, asked if I was going to give a speech like in the old days when I made the men line up on Monday mornings. The remark was meant to be light, but it stung like salt in a wound, because I heard in it not memory, but mockery. I felt my face grow hot, and yet no words came out. A man who has spent his life giving orders does not easily find language for his own defense, especially when the people across the table are those for whom he built his life. I put my hands on the arms of the chair, feeling the nail heads under my fingertips, remembering the nights when I sat in it long after the factory had gone dark, trying to balance accounts, trying to keep paychecks from bouncing, trying to keep faith with the men who depended on me. That chair had borne the weight of my fatigue, of my decisions, of my failures, and my stubbornness, and now my son was telling me it bore none of that anymore, that it belonged to him as though leather and wood could transfer loyalty as easily as a set of keys. The meal went on, though I could barely taste the food, each bite thick in my mouth. I heard them talk about vacations, about Caleb's new deal with an out-of-state supplier, about Erin's cousin moving to Arizona, and through it all the words echoed, "That chair isn't yours anymore." I wanted to ask, what else isn't mine? My name on the sign? My place in the family? My voice at this table? But I swallowed it all down with the lukewarm wine, and when Erin offered me dessert, I declined, though I usually never said no to something sweet. After dinner, when the dishes were being cleared, I stood, and for a moment rested my hand on the back of the chair. Caleb noticed, and said more sharply this time, "Dad, I meant it. Leave the chair. It's part of my office now." His tone was clipped, the way a man speaks to an employee who is about to overstep his role. Something in me wanted to grip the chair and drag it across the room just to prove that wood and leather remember their maker. But instead, I let go. My hand felt empty, colder than the evening air outside. Aaron gave me a glance, half apologetic, half complicit, and then turned back to the sink. I walked home alone under the orange glow of the streetlights, the chill tightening in my chest, not entirely from the weather. It is a peculiar kind of grief to be dispossessed not by strangers, not by creditors, not by the government, but by the child whose first crib you built with your own calloused hands. In that moment, I realized the shift was not only in furniture, but in the order of things. My authority, my presence, my role had been reclassified from necessary to obsolete, and no polite word had been offered to cushion the fall. I thought of Ruth, and how she would have said gently, "He didn't mean it the way it sounded," but I knew in my bones that he had meant exactly what it sounded like. That night I sat in my own house, in the smaller chair by the lamp Ruth had once chosen, and I tried to tell myself it was just a careless remark, that I was making too much of it. But as the hours passed, I knew it was not just a remark. It was a declaration, a line drawn. The chair was only the beginning. What was being taken from me was not leather and brass, but dignity, history, the right to belong in the very story I had written with my years. And once such things are stripped away, they rarely return. The following week, I told myself I would do the sensible thing and give the boy room. Yet by Tuesday, the factory smell had reached my street on a west wind, and the old habit turned my truck toward the river before I decided anything at all. And when I stepped into the lobby, a young woman I didn't know lifted her head from behind a screen and asked, with a careful brightness that made me feel as if I were a customer, whether I had an appointment, and when I answered that, I was here to see my son. She asked for my name as though I were introducing myself to the brand, not to the place that had carried my name on the door for 40 years. She handed me a yellow sticker that said "Visitor" in fat black letters and asked me to wait on a sofa that looked like a dentist's idea of comfort. And she explained that for safety reasons, no one was allowed on the floor without a hard hat, steel, toes, and an escort. And while she spoke, I could see through the glass the long rectangle of the assembly line and the men moving in the rhythm I know better than my own pulse. And I felt the badge peeling at the corner under my thumb like a label on a jar you mean to wash clean. Caleb arrived with a smile that flashed quick and managerial, then cooled by 2 degrees when he saw the sticker on my lapel. And he said the new insurer insisted on protocols, and that it wasn't personal, and he offered to show me the redesigned office instead of the floor because there was an OSHA walkthrough this morning and we don't need any variables. And the word variable from my son's mouth applied to me made something ancient in my chest stir like an animal that does not like to be named. The office that had once been mine had been rearranged into a glass cube with a pale desk that looked suspiciously like plastic, and a chair that might cradle a man's posture but would never learn his shape. And on the wall where Ruth's photograph had hung there was a framed poster of the new logo, Whittaker, the serif cleaned up, the ampersand gone as if sons were just a phase, and beneath it the tagline Aaron must have written because it sounded like an advertisement for soap, crafted for modern living, which is the kind of sentence that tells you nothing about joints or weight or a man's back at the end of the day. Caleb talked for a while about streamlining the SKU count and rationalizing supplier tiers, and I listened because I have always believed listening is part of faithfulness. But as he spoke, I noticed a stack of lookbooks on the credenza showing chairs, with the right silhouette and none of the soul, the wood grained like a photograph rather than like a tree. And I knew in a quiet, horrible way that something sacred was being thinned until it could slide through a spreadsheet without snagging. When I asked to walk back to the floor for 5 minutes to say hello to the crew, he glanced at his watch and said there was a stand-up meeting in 15, and he didn't want to confuse the chain of command, yet he called maintenance and asked them to bring up the old brass plaque with my name on it because he had been meaning to put it in a heritage display. And he kept talking while I stared at the ghost square on the painted cinder block where the plaque had hung for years, a bright rectangle, surrounded by darker paint, like a photograph taken away from a mantle. I finally did make it onto the floor later that morning when the safety man, a nervous fellow in his 30s who smelled of new leather and policy, came with hard hats and a printed route, and he walked me past the sanding stations while reciting rules about eye protection in a tone people reserve for children and violators, and I nodded, because fighting him would have been punching a cardboard cutout. And I let my eyes do the work, counting the new faces, noticing the vanished ones. Larry at the lathe was gone, his station now manned by a temp in a neon vest, consulting a tablet every few seconds like a priest reading from a teleprompter. And Dee's upholstery table had been pushed against the far wall, where the light is poor, and where her laughter used to lace through the din, there was only the hiss of a pneumatic stapler and the flat faces of young men who had never had to beg a hide to give them another half-inch. One of the boys, trying to be kind, called me legend as I passed, and the word hit me like a framed diploma in a hallway where real work does not occur. And the safety man smiled as though the museum tour were going splendidly. And when we finished the loop, he deposited me back in the lobby with the care of someone returning a borrowed object before the clock ran out. The small humiliations began to arrange themselves like chairs around a table. An email announcing Founders Friday, with a sepia-toned photo of me and copy that credited Caleb for modernizing our legacy. A quarterly newsletter that listed me as Chairman Emeritus, a title I had never agreed to and that meant nothing except you cannot vote. A rumor circulating among suppliers that the old man had become forgetful and that Aaron had gently persuaded him to rest. A rumor I recognized by the way new people slowed their speech for me, pronouncing syllables like directions to a lost driver. I received an invitation to speak at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast about entrepreneurship, written in the same chipper tone that had handed me the visitor sticker, and when I asked Caleb if he was coming, he said he had a call with the bank, but that Aaron would be there to introduce me because optics mattered. And I understood then that my life had become a set piece in my own house. A moral used to sell the new line of dining chairs we now imported in pieces and finished with a stain that smelled wrong to me from 20 feet away. One afternoon I stopped by unannounced with a bag of maple bars from the bakery the crew likes. And when I reached for the side door, I found it keyed into the new system and my code no longer worked. And through the glass, I saw Tony from shipping hesitate in that painful way a good man hesitates when instructed to do a bad thing. And he came to the door and said in a low voice that security had been tightened after a near miss. And he offered to take the donuts in for me, and I said no, I would hand them out myself like a man. And he whispered that he could get in trouble. And I heard in that whisper the sound of a rope snapped taut between us. And I stepped back and stood there with a greasy bag in my hand, feeling like a burglar in a place I had built board by board. Later that day, Caleb phoned and said I put Tony in a tough spot, and perhaps I could call ahead next time because the staff were confused about instructions and hierarchy, and he didn't want to undermine his plant manager. And I listened and breathed through my nose and said I would do better. And after we hung up, I ate a maple bar at the kitchen counter and tasted only the sugar, none of the comfort. The first real public slap came at the Fall Open House, an event we had always used to let customers tour the shop, shake hands with the men who made their furniture, and place orders while apples mulled in crock-pots on workbenches. This year, Erin and her team had turned it into something slick with a photo booth and a signature cocktail and a hashtag. And there was a stage with a light bar and a big screen that ran a video in which my story had been edited into a tidy origin myth with the splinters sanded off. I was scheduled to say a few words between the influencer's remarks and the unveiling of the new line. And when I wandered toward the finishing room to look at a run of walnut tops, I was intercepted by a young man with a headset who asked me to please remain in the green room so they could cue me. And the phrase green room in my factory made me want to walk straight out the loading dock. But I sat in a folding chair and waited while the video told the crowd that the company had been reborn under visionary leadership. And when my turn came, I stepped up and spoke as I have always spoken, from the gut, about hands and patience and wood that refuses to lie. And the applause came and went like a polite shower of rain, and then Caleb strode out with his sleeves rolled and took the mic and announced a strategic partnership with a national retailer that would triple volume and democratize our designs. And the crowd cheered in the way people cheer for a bigger future. And I so felt a small shift under my feet as if the floor had flexed. Not long after that, the bank called to schedule a meeting about renewing the line of credit. And out of habit, they called me first. And I said naturally that I would attend with my son. And when I told Caleb, he looked uncomfortable and said that wasn't necessary because he had it covered. And I smiled and said I would come anyway, because sometimes history in the room keeps hands steady. And he finally agreed, but asked me to let him lead. On the day of the meeting, the banker, new, young, hair too neat, shook Caleb's hand first and offered me a bottle of water like you offer a neighbor at a block party. And as we sat, he brought up a concern about margin pressure, given our new price, points, and I opened my mouth to talk about the risk of substituting veneer for solid where the human body tells the difference. But Caleb laid a light hand on my sleeve, as if I were a panel that needed muting, and answered with a slide deck that promised efficiencies and brand reach. And the banker nodded and scribbled and gave me a smile that said, the old man was beloved but not required. And I felt the strange temptation to become loud, simply to prove I was not imaginary. And I swallowed it because I will not turn myself into a caricature to win the attention of a world that prefers pictures. On a gray Thursday when the river smelled metallic and the sky hung low like a lid, I went to the plant again with the clean intention of making a short visit, shaking a few hands and getting out of the way. And I had almost succeeded when I stepped in a half-yard over the taped yellow line that marks the safe corridor by the spray booth, a line I myself had insisted on painting years ago when a new hire complained of dizzy spells. And immediately a whistle chirped, and a guard I had never seen before strode up and asked me in a voice firm enough for a child crossing the street to accompany him to the office to watch a safety video before I continued. And I said gently that I had written the first safety manual in this building and that the video would not teach me what lacquer fumes do to a man's lungs. But the guard's face did not change. Before I could decide whether to yield or argue, Caleb appeared with that flattened smile of his and said the policy is the policy, and that he could not have exceptions because exceptions become stories, and stories become liabilities. And then, in a tone I had used on employees who came to work hungover, he added that if I could not comply, he would have to ask me to leave the floor. There are moments when a man hears the hinges of his life complain, and this was one because in front of two workers and a guard, and the narrow eyes of a foreman who had never seen me hold a chisel, my son used a phrase that contains the humiliation of a lifetime. And I, who once had the keys to every lock in that building on a ring that clipped to my belt, was escorted to the lobby like a trespasser. On the sidewalk I stood with my hands in the pockets of my jacket, while the wind skimmed the top of the river, and the trucks back to the dock with the sharp beeps that mark commerce in every town, and I told myself to breathe and to count to 10, and to walk away, and I did, because men who have built do not throw stones at their own windows. But I also understood, in the slow, honest way truth comes when you stop arguing with it, that the little humiliations weren't little. That each was a board removed from a bridge I had to cross daily, and when enough boards go missing, a man has to find another way over or accept the water. That evening, calculating my breath with the percolator's hiss, I decided that if the boy wanted rules, I would learn the rules better than he did. And if he wanted ownership clear, I would make it clearer than his slogans. And if he wanted me off the floor, then perhaps I ought to step into a room where floors are made of paper and signatures weigh more than steel. Because the first escalation, as any woodworker knows, is not the moment a screw bites, but the quiet turn of the driver when you feel the threads catch and know the piece will hold or split. I had convinced myself that perhaps the humiliations were temporary, that a son under pressure might speak sharply, that a business straining at its seams might demand stricter rules. But one afternoon in late November, when the wind off the river carried the smell of varnish and ash, I walked through the plant unannounced and saw with my own eyes the truth that ended all illusions. I had intended only to drop off a box of donuts, a small gesture of habit, but as I crossed the threshold, I caught sight of the production board that once carried handwritten notes in chalk, now replaced by a glossy screen flashing metrics in red and green. Numbers were neat, yet behind them I could hear the muttering of men who once looked me in the eye with pride, but now kept their heads low, and when they saw me, they offered nods tinged with embarrassment, as if my presence reminded them of something better that had been traded away. I lingered in the shadows by the finishing line and listened, unseen, as two younger workers whispered about hours being cut, about suppliers delivering cheap composites instead of true maple, about orders returned from customers who complained the stain peeled under heat. They spoke Caleb's name not with respect, but with that careful bitterness men use when the boss is absent. And though they did not notice me, I felt every syllable fall like a nail in my chest. Then, through the thin wall of the glassed-in office, I heard the unmistakable timbre of my son's voice, firm, impatient, explaining to a visitor, one of the bank officers, judging by the suit, that the company was on the brink of expansion and that legacy methods were the problem. My legacy, the very foundation on which his salary rested, was being described as a liability. I stepped closer, my hand against the cold glass, and though I could not hear every word, I caught enough. The old man doesn't understand modern scale. He thinks craftsmanship can beat logistics, but nostalgia doesn't pay loans. We keep him out of the way for morale, a kind of mascot, a mascot. That was what I had become in my own house of labor. My knees buckled slightly and I leaned on the wall for support, remembering nights when I had slept on that floor during floods to keep the machines dry, when I'd pawned my watch to cover payroll, when men had thanked me for not letting their families starve. Now, in the mouth of my son, all of that was dismissed as quaint, outdated, an obstacle to profit. I wanted to storm in and demand an explanation, to seize him by the shoulders and remind him whose blood and years had built those walls. But another sound stilled me. Laughter. His, easy and dismissive, shared with the banker, as though mocking me united them. That laughter was worse than insult. It was confirmation that the shift was complete, that my son had crossed the river and burned the bridge behind him. When he emerged from the office, I forced my face into neutrality, and he greeted me with the kind of polite surprise one offers a stranger at a reception. "Dad, I didn't expect you. We're busy today," he said, and then, lowering his voice so only I could hear, "It's best if you don't come around without notice. It disrupts things. I nodded, too stunned to answer, and walked slowly toward the exit, my shoes echoing on the concrete. The men avoided my eyes, not out of malice but out of shame, for they had overheard too, and they knew silence was their only protection. Outside the air was sharp, the river gray with winter, and I stood a long while clutching the empty box that still smelled faintly of sugar. I thought of Ruth, of how she had once said our greatest work was not the chairs or tables, but the dignity we gave to those who built them. And I realized that dignity had been stripped away, not only from me, but from everyone inside. That night, alone in my kitchen, I sat without turning on the light, replaying his words. A mascot, nostalgia, liability. They circled in my skull until I understood that this was not merely about a chair or an office, but about erasure, about being rewritten out of the story while still breathing. The midpoint of a man's downfall is not when others forget him. It is when his own children declare him unnecessary. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand shaking, and swore silently that I would not be erased so easily. In the weeks that followed that gray Thursday when my son made a policy out of my existence, the humiliation stopped arriving as single pebbles and began to come down like a slide, a steady rush that picked up everything loose in its path, and, though I told myself to keep my head low and my temper lower, there is a point at which a man who has allowed himself to be turned into a symbol remembers he is still made of bone and breath and a will that has not yet signed itself away. It began, as avalanches often do, with something small enough to ignore. A bright brochure slipped under my front door on a Saturday morning when the street was still blue with cold. A glossy pamphlet from a place called Cardinal Pines that promised active living. Photographs of seniors in spotless sweaters holding cups of tea, the kind of picture that makes loneliness look like a choice. Tucked inside, on company letterhead, was a note from Aaron written in a cheerful hand telling me that Caleb had toured the facility and was impressed with their memory care wing. That there was no pressure, of course, but if I was curious, she had already put my name on the list because good places fill fast. I read it twice without feeling my fingers, and then a third time, slowly, and on the third reading I noticed the smaller print at the bottom of the packet, the one that said medical power of attorney on file expedites admission. And though my name was not on any line, I could see in that moment how the scene was meant to play. A concerned family at a tidy desk, a doctor with a rubber stamp, a signature acquired by warmth or by confusion, and me, placed gently where I could not interfere with. The adult work of people who had mistaken climbing for arriving. On Monday, trying to scrub the insult from my mind, I drove to the plant with a dozen cider donuts, because men have to eat whether or not their managers understand what keeps them standing. And at the side door, Tony, in shipping, the same good man, who had taken my measure with a whisper weeks before, told me I ought to head around to the front because there was a matter I needed to see to, the kind of matter you do not deliver over a threshold. The receptionist, a new one again, they seemed to come like leaves, handed me an envelope addressed by machine to Mr. Whitaker, Sr., as though my name were a position, and inside was a letter from the company's council informing me that the board had voted to amend the bylaws to clarify lines of authority, that only current officers were permitted unescorted access to production areas, and that any interference could constitute a workplace safety violation subject to trespass enforcement. I laughed, a single dry sound that surprised the woman at the desk, because the address line on the letterhead still bore the street name I had fought the city to rename in our second year, and because the vote had supposedly taken place at a board meeting to which I had not been invited, despite the fact that the bylaws I had written with my own pencil required notice for anyone bearing the title Chairman Emeritus, a title they had thrust on me like a corsage they never meant to pin. The receptionist, trying to be kind, said she had a package for me as well, and slid across the counter my old brass desk plaque wrapped in bubble wrap and blue tape, the metal dulled by fingerprints I could not recognize. And she said they were putting together a heritage wall and thought I might like to keep the original. And it was only when I tore the tape with my thumbnail and felt my hands begin to shake that I realized I was holding not an honor, but a receipt. That afternoon, May, who had done payroll in that building since she was 19 and knew the smell of a layoff before HR printed the scripts, called me from her personal phone with her voice low, the way people speak in churches and hospitals, and told me the rumors I had half heard were bone true. Payment terms were being stretched like taffy. Vendors were getting clever about COD. A cash sweep had yanked the cushion from accounts payable. And Caleb had promised the bank a margin improvement that existed only in the PowerPoints Erin had helped him decorate. She said she'd walked past the conference room and seen a draft of covenant terms on the screen, a bridge loan that would roll into a larger facility once the big box retailer purchase orders hit their sell-through trigger, all of it secured by the building and the equipment and, May said, before catching her breath, by the personal guarantees carried forward from the early years which, as far as the bank's records showed, still bore my name because no one had ever undertaken the expensive chore of restructuring the collateral when I retired. That last bit landed like a mallet on the end of a chisel, setting the line running through the wood. I had suspected I still sat somewhere on the paper as a backstop, the kinds of forms a man signs in years when ambition looks like courage. But I had not let myself consider that Caleb might be building a tower of debt on the narrow ledge of a legacy he had already declared ornamental. I asked May to repeat the part about the guarantees so I could hear it in the shape of her breath, and she added, in that blunt tone Midwestern women use when kindness requires precision, that she'd heard Erin on the phone asking the clinic to send over the cognitive assessment results because it would be useful for estate simplification. And May, not one for poetry, said that sounded to her like they were trying to get me declared forgetful on paper so the bank would accept a signature not mine in fact, but mine in effect. I thanked her without saying the words people say in movies about being careful, because people like May do not need lectures about careful. I drove home the slow way past the river, the old bridge scribed against a sky the color of dull pewter, and dug into the box in the hall closet where Ruth had made me keep the originals I always thought redundant, the warranty deed for the land. Under the plant written in my name and then transferred to the company in exchange for shares, the first note from the bank with my signature cutting through the page like a keel, and the subsequent amendments, some neatly recorded, some obviously stapled in a hurry. The more I looked, the more something like heat rose behind my eyes, because the last formal release of my personal guarantee I could find was attached to the equipment refinance from 12 years ago, but there were two later lines of credit layered, atop that like shingles, both of which used a catch-all clause referencing all prior guarantors and successors, the lazy kind of language that banks tuck in when no one is in the mood to comb the closets for bones. 3 days later, the blows stopped arriving on paper and began to show themselves in public where they could draw blood you could not hide. I had not been in church for 2 Sundays, not out of spite, but because the sermons had become crowded with stories about resilience that tasted to me of resignation. And so, when I walked in and took the old spot by the aisle, Mrs. Kruger squeezed my hand and asked if Caleb had told me his news, and when I said no, she blinked twice and said she must have gotten it wrong. But by coffee hour, the news did not need telling because it had been projected on a screen in the fellowship hall as part of a local business spotlight, and there was my son smiling in a video edited by someone who knows how to place music under ambition, announcing that Whitaker was partnering with a global manufacturing ally to scale the spirit of craftsmanship. And though I am not a man to scorn the work of other countries, I have eyes and hands, and I could see, even from the B-roll, the truth that would kill what we had made. Dowels where mortise and tenon belong, sprayed color. Where stain should live, a rhythm designed for price, rather than for the human back. After service, while I waited for my styrofoam cup to fill, a deacon patted my shoulder with paternal pity and told me the Lord had a way of moving us aside to make room for the next generation. And I nodded because I did not trust my throat. Then went home and placed the cup on the counter and watched the thin skin form across the coffee like a failed finish. That evening, Caleb called and opened with a sentence that carried more heat than any fire. "Dad, I need you to be reasonable." He said the bank had raised the spread because rates had jumped, and we were not the only business in town trying to modernize. That it was a rough patch, that everyone was making sacrifices, and then he slid, so quietly I almost missed it, into the reason for his call, which was that there was a document the bank wanted to update. Nothing big, just housekeeping. Something about aligning old guarantees with new language, and, to make it easier, Aaron had booked us a quick appointment with a notary at a co-working space on Riverfront at 10 o'clock Tuesday. No need to hassle with parking at the bank. Just show up and initial a few pages, and we'd be out in 15 minutes. I listened, let him finish every syllable, and then asked whether this had anything to do with the covenant test he'd missed last quarter or the inventory write-down May had whispered to me about because the new line's finish was lifting in customers' kitchens. He inhaled in that way men inhale, when they would like to be furious, but have decided to be managerial, and said he was disappointed I was listening to gossip. And then he wrapped his request in the hardest silk of all, talking not about numbers, but about legacy, about how this moment was exactly why families build together in the first place, so that when the future calls the past, answers in strength. I told him I would not sign anything I had not read with my own eyes in the bank's own office, and something brittle cracked in his voice as he said I was making things complicated, that there were timelines, that the big box purchase orders were real and the bank wanted to move, that he had stuck his neck out by telling them he had my support. I said that for once in his life he would have to bring his neck back in line with his shoulders and tell the truth, and he hung up without goodbye. The next blow wore my son's handwriting, but Aaron's perfume, an email forwarded from the company counsel to my personal account. How he acquired it, I later deduced, by the way my name appeared, on an internal CC list, informing me that due to ongoing disruptions, it would be best if I communicated through counsel when addressing any operational matters, and attached to that was a draft petition to the county court, requesting a temporary protective order barring me from the premises, except by written invitation, an order justified by the need to preserve workplace safety and to avoid confusion among staff given the founder's declining health. I read the petition twice, then a third time, until the words no longer looked like words, but like a stain that would not blend no matter how carefully you wiped. And I felt, beneath the anger, the colder thing Ruth used to warn me about, the impulse to strike so hard you take out the beams supporting the whole roof. I called a friend who has a son of his own, who once mistook ruthlessness for leadership, and asked for the name of his attorney. And by evening, I was sitting at a walnut table that looked suspiciously like one of ours, in a quiet office above a dentist, where a woman named Sanchez, with a gaze like a carpenter's square, listened to me until I finished, then asked 3 questions I had not thought to ask myself. Whether the land under the plant had ever been refinanced separately from the business, whether the bank's last formal file update included a copy of any cognitive assessment attached to my name, and whether I had any email in which anyone in my family asked me to simplify my estate. I told her about the deed exchange, about the lazy language in the later notes, about the Cardinal Pines brochure and Aaron's note, and she wrote without looking up, then told me we would need to see the bank file with our own eyes, and that the easiest way to do that was neither polite nor slow. By then, the story of my decline had gathered enough breeze to billow. At the hardware store, 2 men I had known as boys offered to carry a bag of feed to my truck as if I might drop it on my foot. And at the grocery, a clerk who had rung up Ruth's Milk for 30 years asked me whether I needed help remembering my PIN, and when I said no, her mouth tightened with relief, in the way people are relieved when a test result comes back safe for now. On Thursday, because I have lived long enough to know that a rumor unrebuked becomes a record, I made an appointment with my doctor and endured an hour of questions that would have offended me if they had not been so kindly asked. What day is it? Who? Is the president? Can you draw a clock? Can you repeat these 3 words in 5 minutes? And when I passed, I asked him to sign a letter stating plainly that my mind was sound, and he did, and then he looked at me with a sorrow I recognized from funerals and said, I can keep the chart honest, but I cannot keep your family fair. I folded the letter and placed it in the file where I kept the deed, and the notes, and the old promissory. And as I slid the drawer shut, my phone buzzed with a message from May that made the world tilt. Bank meeting moved up. Monday, 8 a.m. Loan committee plus Caleb plus Aaron. Heard they're pushing to close bridge before quarter end. They think you'll sign Friday at notary. Please be careful. The last of the week's blows struck without touching me, which is sometimes the worst way, because you watch as someone else bleeds from the cut that was meant for you, and know you set the knife down and no one believes it. Dee, whose eyes can sew a straight line in stormlight, called to say she'd been told the tufted line was on indefinite pause, because the new buyers had simplified the SKUS. And there was laughter in her voice that wasn't laughter at all when she said she guessed you don't need button tufts in a world where people sit on phones more than on chairs. And then she told me 2 of the older men had their hours cut to 28 because benefits optimization, and one cried in the parking lot and tried to hide it by saying the wind had blown sawdust into his eyes. I sat with the phone against my ear and said nothing because anything I could offer would have been a consolation prize. In a contest no one had entered, and after we hung up, I took out the plaque the receptionist had handed me and polished it until the dullness lifted and my face looked back at me warped by the letters of my name. And I thought of that banker's neat hair and my son's neat sentences and Aaron's neat plans. And I felt the old animal in me, the one I had kept sleeping with. Discipline and prayer open its eyes. I did not sleep the night before the notary appointment. I brewed coffee at 2, then again at 4, then again at 6, as if caffeine could turn fury into clarity. And when 10 o'clock came, I drove not to the co-working address Aaron had texted, but to the bank itself. Because if a man is to be used as a guarantor, he deserves to look the walls in the face. In the lobby, a receptionist with a polished stone on a chain asked whether I had an appointment, and I said I was there to review my own file. And the way her smile tightened told me I was speaking a language the lobby does not recognize. I asked for the senior credit officer by name, a man I remembered from a Rotary pancake breakfast. And while we waited, I looked at the photographs on the wall, framed prints of local farms and the river and our main street at dusk. And I wondered whether anyone had ever noticed how banks decorate themselves with the things they risk conquering. The officer arrived with a hand extended at the correct angle and said we should loop Caleb in to avoid misunderstandings. And I said I wanted to see the file first because misunderstandings bloom in the dark, and he led me, with visible reluctance, into a room with a long table and a box in the center, the kind of banker's box that holds not only paper, but the history of decisions. He opened the box and took out a folder marked Whitaker Industries, Collateral, Guarantee, and he placed before me copies of the line documents I already owned, and then, a little deeper, addenda I had not seen, the ones that worried May. A reaffirmation of guarantee drafted 3 years ago that bore a signature that looked like mine the way a photograph looks like a face, close enough for a stranger, wrong enough for a son, and attached to that, tucked behind a cover letter from a clinic, a cognitive screening note signed by a physician's assistant affirming mild impairment congruent with age. I can tell you that in that moment I did not shout or pound the table, because I have learned there are times when you do not kick the cabinet. You simply close the door on your fingers and let the pain tell you the truth. I looked up and asked when the bank had acquired this screening. He said it had been provided as context when they rolled the lines, and I asked whether they had ever verified it with me, and he said it had not seemed necessary given the family consensus. And then I asked the only question that mattered to the part of me that still believes in the shape of justice. When the loan committee met on Monday, would this file be the one on the table? He said yes, unless counsel revised it on Friday after the notary visit, at which point they would proceed to vote. I thanked him for his time in a tone that made him shift in his chair, then asked very politely whether the bank still honored written notices revoking personal guarantees prior to extension, and he said of course, provided the notice was properly delivered to the right office with the right names, and I asked whether he might fetch me an envelope and a receipt stamp. And while he was out of the room, I took my folder from my coat, laid the doctor's letter on top of the deed copy like a plank, on a trestle, and began to write the first sentence of the paper that would turn the slide of humiliations into a slope I could climb. When he returned, he tried to make a joke about this being above his pay grade, and I told him gently that he was wrong, that this was precisely his pay grade. To know when a family's story had become a risk and when a bank's appetite had become a hunger, and to prefer the kind of risk a man can look in the eye. I slid the letter into the envelope, waited for the wet stamp to shine and then dry, and walked out past the photographs of the farms and the river and the town as the receptionist wished me a nice day in a voice that had not changed and yet had to, me, because by then I could smell the end of the pretense, the clean scent that comes when wood splits along its true grain. That night the phone rang, and I let it, because what I had to say would be said in a room where the chairs are heavy and the doors are thick and the people at the table balance numbers against names and believe they are the same thing. I sat at the kitchen table with the brass plaque warm from my hands, Ruth's lamp throwing a soft circle of light, and I thought about boys who inherit and men who build, about covenants that hold and promises that rot, about the way a bank's chair feels beneath your palms when you decide to stop asking for permission to belong to your own life. I did not sleep, but I did not tremble, and when the first thin wash of dawn brushed the edge of the window, I put the folder in my coat, buttoned it to the throat like a breastplate, and made myself a cup of coffee strong enough to strip paint. Because the second escalation, I realized as the percolator hissed, is the place where a man stops trying to be invited and begins, without breaking a single rule, to take the one seat that will force everyone else to stand. The morning of the loan committee meeting arrived like a storm long foretold, and though the sky outside was a dull, ordinary gray, to me it felt like thunder had been rolling for weeks, and now the strike would fall. I dressed with the same precision Ruth once teased me for, buttoning my shirt all the way, pressing my tie flat, polishing the shoes that had stood on factory floors, more often than boardroom carpets. In my coat pocket was the folder that had become my shield and my weapon both, the deed copy, the doctor's letter, the notice revoking my guarantee, and a few handwritten notes reminding me of the phrases I would not let anyone twist. I drove not to the co-working space, where Aaron and Caleb no doubt expected to meet a compliant old man, but straight to the bank's stone building, whose brass handles I had once pulled with confidence when asking for capital to expand a plant, not rescue one from collapse. Inside, the lobby smelled of new carpet and coffee, and the receptionist smiled her professional smile until she read my name and stiffened, no doubt warned to expect confusion or difficulty. I told her calmly I was there for the loan committee, and when she asked whether my son was joining me, I said he would discover that answer himself soon enough. They led me to a conference room with a table longer than some of the dining tables we built, and around it sat men and women with binders and laptops, all polished as river stones. Caleb was already there, sleeves rolled, chin high, Erin beside him with a neat stack of documents she had highlighted in cheerful colors. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and calculation, the way a man looks at an unexpected witness, and he began to speak before I had even taken my seat. "Dad, you didn't need to come," he said, forcing a smile toward the bankers. "We had a notary lined up much simpler." His voice carried the faint tremor of someone who realizes his plan has developed a leak. I placed my folder on the table and opened it slowly, as if laying out tools. "If the matter concerns my name, my property, and my reputation, then I will sit in this chair," I said, choosing deliberately the seat at the head, the one Caleb had already half claimed with his body language. A flicker ran across his face, quickly masked, but the committee members shifted slightly, sensing an order they had not rehearsed. The meeting began with Caleb's presentation, a slide deck full of phrases like synergy and scale optimization, graphs pointing skyward as though ambition alone could suspend gravity. I let him finish because interruptions are the refuge of the insecure, and when the banker finally turned to me and asked whether I, as guarantor, endorsed the strategy, I spoke without raising my voice. I laid out the facts: that my guarantee had been formally revoked by written notice now stamped and filed, that my doctor's certification confirmed my competence beyond dispute, that any signature offered in my name without my presence would constitute fraud. Then, with a calmness I did not know I possessed, I slid across the photocopy of the forged guarantee, pointing out the hesitation in the pen stroke, where someone imitated my hand. "This," I said, "is not mine. And you, ladies and gentlemen, have been conducting business on a foundation of forgery." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. One banker coughed, another flipped pages nervously. Erin's color drained, though she tried to keep her professional smile. Caleb began to protest, calling it a misunderstanding, a clerical error, insisting that everyone had been acting in good faith. I let him speak himself into knots, then placed the final sheet, the doctor's letter, on the table. "You have built this expansion on two pillars, the word of my son and the belief that I am incapable of defending myself. Both are false. Withdraw your trust from his word or prepare to face a scandal louder than any quarterly loss." The chairman of the committee leaned back, steepling his fingers. And in that moment, I saw the balance shift. Banks care little for bloodlines. They care for risk. And Caleb, for all his polished charts, had become the risk. Erin whispered urgently in his ear, but his face had already begun to crack, pride giving way to panic. He accused me of betrayal, of sabotaging the family, his voice rising until the chairman raised a hand and told him firmly that the matter would be reviewed and the loan postponed until the documents could be verified. Postponed, an innocuous word, yet I knew it was a sentence. Without the bridge loan, his entire scaffolding would collapse, and every vendor, every worker, every plan that relied on borrowed time would see him not as visionary, but as reckless. When the meeting adjourned, he turned on me in the hallway, his eyes wild, his voice low enough not to echo but sharp enough to cut. "You've destroyed everything," he hissed. "You've ruined your own legacy." I looked at him, my son, the boy who once carved his initials into a scrap of oak in my workshop, and I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only the clarity of truth. "No, Caleb," I said, "I've preserved my legacy." "You tried to sell it cheap?" Erin tugged at his arm, her face tight with fury and fear, and they walked away down the polished corridor, their steps echoing like retreat. I stepped outside into the chill, the sky still gray but the air sharp with the clean scent of iron. For the first time in months, my shoulders loosened. The climax had come not with shouting or fists, but with paper and presence, with the simple refusal to vanish. I had sat once more in the chair, and though it was not the chair of leather and brass in my old office, it was the only one that mattered now, the chair in which a man defends his own name. In the days after the meeting, the silence from Caleb was not the ordinary kind that follows a quarrel. It was the heavy, engineered silence of someone who has been stripped of the ground beneath his feet and is scrambling to pretend he still walks. On solid earth, the bank called me privately to thank me for my candor, their voices careful, respectful, as though acknowledging both the danger they had nearly embraced and the liability they had narrowly avoided. May phoned too, whispering that word had spread fast on the floor, that the men were talking about how the old man had saved them from being sold off piecemeal to a warehouse deal, and though no one would say it loud, their relief was palpable. It struck me then that respect, once lost in a family, sometimes resurfaces first among strangers or almost strangers, people who know what work feels like in their bones. At home, I walked past the file cabinet and closed the drawer with my documents inside, not with triumph, but with the finality of a man who has no need to reach for weapons again. The plaque I had polished sat on the mantel now, not as a trophy but as a reminder, its letters glinting in the lamplight when the evenings turned long and still. I brewed my coffee stronger than ever, sat by the window where the river glimmered cold and sure, and allowed myself to breathe without waiting for the next humiliation. Ruth's absence pressed in as it always had, but alongside it now was a strange, quiet pride, the kind that does not inflate but steadies. Caleb did not visit, and the few emails Erin sent were clipped and legal in tone, as if I had become not a father, but an opponent to be managed. I read them without bitterness, because the truth is you cannot lose what has already been taken, and what had been taken from me was the illusion of family loyalty. What remained and what could not be stolen was my dignity, and the knowledge that I had defended not just myself, but the integrity of the work that bore my name. There is a kind of peace that comes only after battle, not the peace of reconciliation, but the peace of survival. And it is quieter than I expected, yet stronger too. In January, I signed the papers to sell my remaining shares, not to Caleb, but to a group of local craftsmen who had pooled what they could to buy into the company. The bankers were glad to see stability, and the workers, I was told, felt a surge of pride at knowing that part of the business was back in the hands of those who still cared about the grain of wood more than the shine of marketing slogans. I kept enough from the sale to buy a small cabin near the lake where Ruth and I once walked in the evenings, and I moved there with only a few boxes, her lamp, the plaque, the deed copy, and the chair from my den. The silence there was not empty, but full, the kind of silence that allows a man to hear his own thoughts without interruption. Sometimes I imagine Caleb driving past the plant, his jaw tight as he sees the men still working, the orders still being filled without him at the center, and I wonder whether he feels regret or only rage. Perhaps both. But I no longer need the answer. My responsibility was never to preserve his pride at the cost of my own ruin. It was to honor the years of sweat and sawdust and loyalty that built something worth sitting on. If he chooses to learn from the collapse of his schemes, that is his burden. If he does not, then he has chosen exile from his own history. On evenings when the wind carries the smell of wood smoke across the lake, I sit by the fire and think of the long arc of a man's life, how it bends not toward comfort or even toward justice, but toward truth. My truth is simple. I was stripped of my chair, but I found another, sturdier one in the only place that matters, my own resolve. Legacy is not a plaque on a wall or a chair in an office. It is the refusal to let your name be twisted into a liability. I have done that. And though I end my days alone in this cabin, I am not defeated. I am, at last, seated where I belong.